The Sailor's Rest, a Pride and Prejudice variation. A crossover event between Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion. Written by Dawn Jacobson. Performed by Benjamin Fife. Prologue. London, December 10th, 1814. He had been called a man of few passions. This, of course, was a falsehood, not a vile one as far as insults went, but if he were to be tarred by the gossip's brush, he would prefer the town denizens believed him to be a man who kept himself under the strictest regulation. True, there would be those who saw him as an emotionless cipher, whose best employment was a last resort for a hostess desperate to balance her table. Yet he knew and struggled with the fact that he was the opposite, keenly feeling aggrieved at the sneers and slights inflicted upon him by those arrogant enough to ignore evidence of his superior nature. That he could unleash his true nature once in the privacy of his rooms neutralized much of the choler that would have otherwise condemned him to social oblivion. Tonight was one of his worst. The rage boiled even after 2 full goblets of brandy. William stared blindly through the window's distortion onto a darkened streetscape relieved only by the basket torches lighting scattered porticos lining the thoroughfare. The park across the way swallowed any light that dared cross the street. Would anger could vanish that quickly, but it would not. It could not, especially after the final insult delivered in an innocuous letter from his cousin. The news, carefully scribed on finely laid bond, had dashed his dreams and poisoned his hopes. That message now was balled in one fist, while his other worried thumb and forefinger behind his back. She who had been all he desired had bound herself to another, a commoner, a hopped-up preacher's son. What galled him was that her betrothed was wealthy, his pockets fattened through ingenuity rather than in a more gentlemanly manner. William hated the man with an incandescent richness. How could she have ignored all he could offer and accepted this nobody's addresses? Her affianced was someone who would have quickly received a well-earned cut direct if they once again crossed paths. Without a doubt, this varnished specimen soon would shed his false colours and exhibit the uncouth manners of the worst of social parvenus. He was of no consequence and should have been beneath her notice. Despite a comforting belief that his opponent was unsuitable to be in polite company, he detested his rival's calm command of a room. He behaved as if he were lord and master of all he surveyed, even though his domain was tiny and perilously close to annihilation at any moment. The presumption of it all, to act as if he were master of a great Derbyshire land-holding. William loathed the man's comfort amidst a crowd that thrived on winkling out weakness. Rather than appeal to his better's innate nobility, as was only correct and proper, this eccentric, for he would never suggest that the man was an original, disdained all that was au courant. That attitude deflected most social darts thrown his way. He could not be injured by what he ignored. The remaining errors fell to earth while his not inconsiderable connections stood shoulder to shoulder in his defence. Mayhap this enticed an otherwise sensible woman to accept him and eschew a better match. What galled him the most was that if one ignored her tenuous situation, she brought a plethora of gilded markers to the table. Her breeding was as gentle as one could hope for in this changing world. She rose from the land and demonstrated her understanding of the gentry's prerogatives. A distinguished lady had guided her and pushed her toward proper behavior, rather than allowing youthful ardor to turn her head. He would be willing to set aside his disgust at her weakness. After all, what could you expect from her sex? He, William Elliot, demanded, indeed needed, a full-blooded Elliot boy babe to perfect his attenuated claim on the baronetcy. And this nobody had denied him the one Elliot girl, for Elizabeth was a shrew besides being a dried husk, who could bring him across the line. If he were to reverse his fortunes, he would have to be willing to risk it all on a desperate throw. That would take some planning, but he had his friends, and his methods had proven successful over the years of his campaign to move into the upper reaches of the Tarn, using a country baronetcy as his stepping stone. Book 1. From Kellynch and Netherfield to Barton upon Humber. Chapter 1. Outside of Barton upon Humber, February 9th, 1815. He dreamt of his standard tarpaulins. However, they remained in his sea-chest in Newcastle. His boat-cloak, designed for short trips from the frigate to the steps, kept the worst of the wretched sleety rain at bay. However, over time the wool had become sodden. Water dripped from his hat's brim and down his neck, and his hindquarters, he was sure, squelched in the saddle as the frozen precipitation found its way around his legs. Frederick Wentworth was a man searching for safe harbour as the night deepened. After surviving a wintry Baltic, he had been pounding south from Newcastle's roads, Laconia's resting place. Unlike his first command, Asp, the frigate had come close to falling to the Skagerrak's fell currents and fickle winds. After delivering the ambassador to Sweden's court, Laconia had run afoul of the weather. Although the February North Sea was never a mill-pond, a rogue storm tossed Laconia like a cork floating in a rambunctious toddler's bath, the shriek of topmen flying from the mainmast yards, to be embraced by grey froth arms, bedevilled his nights. When Chips explained that a seam had sprung during the 3-day-long gale, Wentworth knew for the first time that twisting feeling low in his belly when he thought how his wordless disappearance would grieve Anne. Yet that idea also galvanized the Laconia's captain into action. He would not be separated from her love again. He shook his fist at the inevitability of his ship's loss. With nearly 7 feet of water in the well, every man from the smallest ship's boy to her captain manned the pumps through every bell of every watch for 4 interminable days, as the wallowing ship lugged its way toward friendly shores. As Laconia made Newcastle's roads, Wentworth took the helm, as the ship's boats ferried all hands ashore. Then the captain carefully brought his wounded charge into the shallows, and allowed Laconia to settle on the mud until the port superintendent could muster his forces to unburthen the frigate of her battery and masts. Her next stop would be the breaker's yard. Wentworth mourned her, as would the captain of any ship who sacrificed herself to deliver her crew safely home. Land-bound mortals would never understand the attachment sailors had for their seafaring homes. Old hands fondly would recall vessels from decades before, speaking of the ships not as contraptions made of metal, wood, and cordage, but rather as the ultimate examples of another living species. Yet he could find no cause to repine, for her eventual demise had been writ in Whitehall after the departure of the beast to his Elban exile. Wentworth thought he had escaped his Admiralty masters when the swiftly called court-martial absolved him and commended his duty to ship and crew. He barely had buckled his sword-belt when a marine handed him a packet closed with blobs of carmine wax, impressed with the familiar seal of the fouled anchor. His orders were opaque, and only insisted that he turn over Laconia's command to his first lieutenant, and make haste to the Admiralty. The question of how the Navy's black-clad clerks knew he had hove to in the far north barely registered. He earlier had advised London of his mission's successful completion. The mysteries of the Admiralty were not the concern of a post-captain. Wentworth's life had been one of unquestioning dedication to the pursuit of orders. This summons was but another in a long chain. Wentworth's attention slipped the colder he became. He did not notice the small chaise travelling behind him, carefully picking its way to avoid spoke-shattering ruts. The shadow neither passed nor dropped too far behind to be out of sight. His seaman's eye picked up a change in the mist ahead. A flicker from a shielded glim beckoned to him in hospitality, promising a warm bed, or at least a dry bench in the common room. He had spent so many years surviving shipboard damp that even a modest reduction of his discomfort would be as welcome as a guest-chamber eider-down comforter on his brother's Somersetshire estate. The chance to shed layers of sopping cloth fixed his attention. 100 yards further down the track, the wavering light firmed into baskets roaring their orange welcome as pitch-soaked dunnage simmered. Wentworth urged his horse toward the stables behind the lodging-house, the Sailor's Rest. The name warmed him with the knowledge that he had reached the halfway point in his journey. Frederick had discovered the inn's smoke-darkened comforts as a youngster, detailed north to fill a midshipman's berth. Now he had 2 more days to London, and, assuming their lordships would release him, another 3 to his wedding in Bath, and Anne. For tonight, the Sailor's Rest was an auspiciously named location to end a miserable day. Darcy sanded the fresh ink and tapped clean his letter to Elizabeth. Another few moments saw the missive precisely folded and sealed. He then was leisurely leaning back in the indifferently cushioned armchair and stretching his unshod feet toward the fire sparking in the grate. Today's battle of the elements faded as the blaze easily trumped the remaining 3. Water, earth, and air had conspired to make his dash from the Great North Road to the coast an unmitigated misery. Within 3 miles of turning toward Barton-upon-Humber and the ferry to Kingston, rain clouds scudded in from the North Sea and turned the road into a frozen quagmire. Upon reflection, an exercise for which Darcy had had ample time as he slogged east, staying on the main line toward York would have been prudent. However, he had abandoned reason to shorten tomorrow's final leg to Scarborough. The sooner he completed his business, the quicker he could return to Elizabeth's side. The ferry across the estuary would cut hours from his pilgrimage to be useful to his friend. In my hurry to prove that I am not an officious interfering twit, I place myself at the mercy of alluring eyes. No, not Elizabeth's, although I could swim in those chocolate puddles forever. Bingley, however, also has my number. I may have professed to allow him a life without my management, but I, in turn, fell under his thrall, mayhap through guilt at my earlier interference. Damn those puppy-dog orbs of his! He knew perfectly well that I could not deny a simple request from an injured man. Less than a fortnight ago, Bingley's hunter had balked at a stile, and sent the young man flying over the hedge and into the field beyond. Youthful reflexes led him to use his arms to cushion his landing. That saved him from breaking his neck, but not his left arm. Mr. Jones splinted the wing, and the apothecary quickly reduced Bingley's dislocated right shoulder. Mrs. Bennet, however, was not so readily cured of her worry that Miss Bennet would become a widow before she was even wed. Longbourn and Mr. Bennet were abandoned. Instead, the good woman decamped to Netherfield to ensure her future son survived. That she stood as a chaperone for Bingley's nursing matron, Miss Bennet, was a happy circumstance that allowed her eldest daughter to remain by Bingley's side. Wanting to avoid extended conversations with Mother Bennet, but be useful to Bingley, Darcy was easy prey for his best friend's appeal. "Darcy, I received news just before my tumble that something was amiss at Scarborough Mills. My solicitor got wind of financial shenanigans. The usual, you know. An increase in lost orders combined with subtle lifts in the cost of materials. Nothing he could pick apart from a distance. He urged me to take a fortnight in the north. Seemed sensible to me. After all, Jane and Elizabeth have yet to travel into town to purchase their wedding clothes. Mrs. Bennet told me that their shopping would demand at least a sennight. Our future mother also reminded me that her daughters were marrying wealthy men. The Mrs. Bennet cannot wear ready-made frocks. Given that we have plenty of time before the ceremony, and that I cannot brave over 200 miles of good roads, do you think you could find it in yourself to travel north as my proxy?" At that, ginger eyebrows lifted and blue eyes widened in an unignorable plea. Elizabeth's gentle nudging overcame his resistance. She could see William's reserve cracking in the face of every fresh maternal onslaught. Her whispered affirmation of all that Bingley had said led Darcy to agree that his continued presence at Netherfield was unnecessary. Charles also had promised that there was no expectation of Darcy taking a morning visit to Aunt Millicent Bingley's parlour. Any encounter with the exiled Caroline Bingley could thus be avoided. That last obstacle overcome, Darcy set out on Prater and picked up the Great North Road outside Hatfield. Now, 2 days later, the front of this establishment, the Sailor's Rest, had beckoned him. That Darcy was willing to set aside his more fastidious behaviour was a testament to the misery he had endured over the last hour before he pulled Prater's head gently into the mews and guided him toward the stable's warm funk. He awaited dinner in the establishment's one private parlour. Darcy comforted himself with a libation poured from a dusty green bottle, obviously something the proprietor had reserved only for his infrequent, well-heeled guests. Drink was the last and least of Darcy's needs. Rather than depend upon hauteur in the harbour town, Darcy applied the other commodity of which he had a surfeit. The appearance of a guinea smoothed the innkeeper's furrowed brow. That worthy quickly collected Darcy's dripping greatcoat and equally damp topcoat. Hoby's best riding boots were spirited away to the grooms for buffing and fresh oil. Now all that remained was something to fill the emptiness beneath his ribs. A rap on the door signalled, Darcy assumed, the arrival of his repast. However, when the panel creaked open, there was no food. The owner bowed his way into the room, wondering if "Your Honour would consent to share his chamber with a naval gentleman." The old Darcy would have exercised his prerogative of first come, first served. However, having spent months being schooled by Elizabeth in the pleasure of sketching unknown personalities, he acceded to the needs of another. He pragmatically considered how he would have felt if forced to sit, cheek by jowl, with Carters, Smiths, and Wainwrights. As the innkeeper rated him a naval gentleman, his rank only could be lieutenant or higher, all suitable company. Darcy readily agreed, taking the view that beggars could not be choosers. He could dine in solitary splendour, or hope that his companion was not a dullard with a heightened opinion of his importance. In any event, the acquaintance would be brief, severed upon dinner's end. Taking the optimistic view, Darcy hoped for a lively conversation about the Navy's prospects with Napoleon's Mediterranean exile. The landlord latched the door after accepting another guinea, and Elizabeth's letter to be sent express. The man promised to return with Darcy's dinner company. Chapter 2. Watkins had pulled on a flat cap when he exited his coach behind his quarry's resting place. He did not expect anyone in this coastal town to recognize him, but he had not survived England's netherworld without being cautious. Once inside, he leaned against the bar and kept a weather eye on his target, who stood near the great room's fireplace warming his hands. Watkins' life as for-hire eyes or muscle paid well enough for him never to consider changing employment. Most recently, he had found his way into the notice of a nose-high lordling-to-be. The fool never questioned Watkins' tariffs. The thug's brawn also intimidated the soft-handed gentleman, so there was never any doubt about prompt payment. His target was thoroughly different from Watkins' employer. His dark boat cloak shrouded his body, hiding almost all distinguishing features. Bareheaded with his hair clubbed back in an old-fashioned naval queue, his face was a weathered walnut hue. His eyes seemed locked in a perpetual squint. Of medium height, broad in the shoulders, the man carried himself with the surety of someone who was very dangerous, either in action or repose. A cross-hatch of paper-thin white scars, markers of years spent in close combat with sharp-edged weapons, distinguished his hands. All added up to confirm what Watkins had been told of the Navy man. He was capable and threatening. Removing him from the board would demand care and uncommon stealth. Typically, Watkins would have firmly applied a leather glove filled with musket balls to the base of the skull. The improvised weapon would darken any man's lights, often sending him on his final journey. However, the one who had hired Watkins insisted that methods used to incapacitate this Wentworth fellow could not be fatal. A different fate was in store, something that mattered little to Watkins. Fat purses filled with gold purchased his indifference. Out of the corner of his eye, he observed a hurried conference between Wentworth and the aproned hostler. A coin changing hands in thanks presaged the proprietor leading the way toward the back of the inn. After no more than 5 minutes, the owner returned alone, with clothing draped over one arm and carrying a pair of boots. "Must also be the way to any private dining rooms, because the stairs to where the lucky ones can doss down for the night are behind me. Maybe a servant's stairwell, though that is not important. Nobody I care about will be using their bed tonight." He pushed back from the bar, reached under his coat, and made a show of hitching up his trousers. He drained his tankard of ale, belched, and pushed threepence across the counter at the barman. He asked loudly where he could find "the convenience of the house." As expected, he was pointed down the same dark hall. Playing unsteady on his pins, Watkins made his way out to the mews and the outhouse, shoulder-checking the walls as he went. His reconnaissance showed but 2 doors. One entered the kitchen in the rear of the house, while the second fed a room facing the street. Once Watkins had stepped into the mews, he casually turned the wrong way toward the inn's front. A window throwing a watery yellow light into the alley confirmed his assumptions about the building's floor plan. The chamber he wanted took up the corner and gave unobserved access for what was to come. Not wishing to alert the occupant, he stopped before crossing before the French-style casement, rarely used in town for the ease of breaking in. A knife slipped between the frames could flip the latch. Instead, Watkins spun on his heel, set sail out the other side, and stopped by his rented chaise to remove a dark lantern from beneath the seat. He lit it, closed the shutter, and stepped onto the hard above the river. Wentworth followed the innkeeper into the private dining room. Although used to being his own master, the captain had never been so full of himself to believe that it was his prerogative to evict the current occupant. That person stood in stocking feet and shirt sleeves, looking somewhat uncomfortable to be so informally clad. Always one to quickly grasp the situation, Wentworth read the man and tried to ease his discomfort. Before we do the pretty which all Englishmen seem to be so fond of, allow me to thank you for your gentlemanly behaviour in allowing me to share this room with you." Before Darcy could reply, Wentworth continued, "You, sir, seem a most sensible gentleman. On the other hand, I have tried to stand upon false dignity and, in the process, risk catching a chill. I have seen far too many strong men laid low by what they call a trifling cold. Allow me to follow your example and divest myself of what our most excellent host assures me can dry before the kitchen fire. Then we can be made known to one another on equal footing, if you will forgive my lamentable wordplay." Forestalling Darcy again, the captain made a show of undoing the frogs of his cloak and shrugging out of it. This he draped over an empty chair. His topcoat quickly followed. Finally, he dropped into the seat and accepted the innkeeper's assistance to pull off his footwear. The man gathered Wentworth's outerwear and departed, promising to send a servant with dinner and drink. Rolling his shoulders to relieve the accumulated tension, Wentworth turned to Darcy. "Again, sir, thank you for inviting me to join you. If I may introduce myself, I'm Frederick Wentworth, post-captain, lately of His Majesty's frigate Laconia. I am ordered to attend my masters at the Admiralty, but found myself caught in this filthy weather. Thus, sir, your hospitality is most appreciated." Darcy gave a half-bow. "It seems, sir, that you have more right to be here than I, since you are a nautical man seeking sanctuary at an auspiciously named Sailor's Rest. I am Darcy, Fitzwilliam Darcy, of Pemberley in Derbyshire. I find myself heading in the opposite direction as you, and, if you will allow a bit of seaborne imagery, am but a lonely ship, having dropped anchor for the night. I find myself here in Barton, on my way to Scarborough." Darcy motioned to Wentworth. "Take a pew, Captain. I assure you your company is appreciated. I spent far too much time today alone with my thoughts, damp as they were, staring at my stallion's ears. As stout as Prater may be, he is a taciturn fellow. Landsman you may be rated, Mr. Darcy, but I scan that you are no lubber. I imagine you could more than fight your weight, if you were on one of Laconia's 18-pounders. That said, and I do not doubt that the gunner would be sad to lose your broad shoulders, I could also see you on the windward side of any quarter-deck in the fleet, driving your ship across the stern of a frog frigate. You never considered a naval career, I take it?" "My family has no salt in its blood," Darcy snorted. "Mud courses through my cousin Richard's veins. He is now a brigadier attached to Wellington in Vienna, although I have gotten the sense that he recently has become involved in some of the government's more irregular activities. The last I heard, Fitzwilliam had returned to Horse Guards for a conference. My estate has been rare busy, growing grain and wool since the tyrant took it into his head to try to conquer the world. As the eldest, and only, son, my responsibilities became manifold when my father left this world in the year 6. Wentworth sobered. "Please forgive my speculations, Mr. Darcy. I had no intention of churning up difficult memories." Darcy waved a quelling hand. "Please, sir, do not trouble yourself. While my father's passing was an unhappy time, it has been nearly 9 years. I do miss him. There are still moments when I feel his steadying hand on my shoulder, especially when wrestling with a challenging problem." Darcy filled his glass anew and poured Wentworth his first draught. Then, as the fire spat and sizzled in the grate, both men lapsed into a companionable silence, each wrapped in his own contemplations. The Sailor's Rest repast would never be confused for his Aunt Matlock's table. Darcy's tastes ran to simpler country fare, which the innkeeper's man laid before him and Wentworth. By the time the pair had demolished their bowls of mutton stew, they had descended into comfortable familiarity. Wentworth's hearty appetite reminded him of Richard Fitzwilliam's uncommon ability to dent the Darcy house larder. The captain's appraisal of the meal spoke to seaborne realities. "This beats the dried peas and salt pork you get after 3 months on blockade duty." As Darcy had hoped, the conversation was engaging, and ranged from the day's greater topics to life aboard a naval vessel. Wentworth was a different sort of military man, unlike any Darcy had known. His only experience outside Fitzwilliam was the odd horse guards functionary entertained at the Countess's table when the Earl sought advantage in one scheme or another. Whenever Richard and his small official family of captains and lieutenants broke bread at Darcy House, the conversation soon left Darcy in the dust. His reserve prevented him from being a part, as he was unwilling to show his ignorance of things military. Thus he was sidelined when bread barges, port decanters, and wine glasses became brigades, regiments, and companies moving about the best cloth's snowy expanse. Richard's account of Ciudad Rodrigo's storming was most engaging from a spectator's point of view. Wentworth seemed shy to trumpet his successes, although Darcy divined that his dinner companion was well on his way to becoming a chicken nabob, if not one full-blown. Prize money was not something with which Darcy was comfortable. "I do not know, Wentworth, if I can countenance an idea that smacks of government-sanctioned piracy." Wentworth did not seem put off by this reaction. "Seems normal enough, Darcy, although I grew up inside the system, and can only see the advantages. The nature of naval warfare is different from 2 armies slugging it out on land, where men on the receiving end have 2 choices, fight or break. 'Tis not as if my men can cut and run. They go where the ship does. Their reward is maybe £20 a year, something they don't see until the paymaster's barge appears and found. Their slops are deducted from their wages. The wee bit of loot a British tar gets off a capture is the found. They will come away with some pounds and shillings if they fight and win. That keeps them at their guns and flying over the railings into the frog forecastles when I order them to board. And if we take a ship that gets bought into the Navy, it saves the Exchequer from having to pay for a new ship that'll take a good year or more to bring into service. My Laconia used to sail under the tricolour. If I get a 2/8 share of the prize court's judgment, the Admiralty will have no cause to repine." Darcy took a pull on his wine and smiled into his goblet. "Seems a system with a solid basis, rather than the army's traditional form of ransacking corpses and conquest. That encourages the worst behaviour, rape, pillage, and burning, which leaves nothing but a black mark in the British copybook. Even so, my cousin, the brigadier, tells me that many a British soldier found his fortune in the dust of Vittoria, in the year 13, when Napoleon's half-wit brother brought the entire Spanish treasury to the fight. Seems he was more concerned that someone would try to steal it if he left it in Madrid's strong-rooms. One of Fitzwilliam's sergeants returned with a hat full of doubloons and 16 fair-sized diamonds of the first water, including a blue that Prinny covets." Wentworth spied the writing slope and asked if he could borrow it to write a letter to his betrothed. Darcy smiled and said he would be happy to offer the loan of what he had earlier used to write to his Hertfordshire love. While the captain bowed over the paper, Darcy stuck his head into the hall to call the servant to clear the table and bring some port and cheese. Watkins had earlier marked the shambling footman. Charity indeed, considering the man was fetching and carrying at a shabby inn, rather than a shining Grosvenor Square edifice. He lurked in the gloom when the menial had left the private room, lugging a tray filled with dirty dishes. A completed meal was rock-hard evidence that somebody occupied the chamber. Watkins did not consider whether the sticky trenchers indicated 1 man or 5. Numbers mattered not. His task was delivering the prey he knew would be in the room. Watkins' pay depended on the size of his fists, and his willingness to use them, not his brain's agility. When the servant returned from the kitchen, he carried a decanter and a platter of cheese. That was when Watkins stepped forward, his outstretched hand holding 2 guineas. The servant's eyes widened, and he tipped his head quizzically, asking the unvoiced. A silent finger pointed at the carafe. Transactions like this were commonplace in the dank hallways of the average waterfront inn. The few glittering coins slid from one palm to another, backs turned, and Watkins' shadowy hand drained a vial of clear liquid into the carmine pool. A swirl of wine stirred the potion. In a few moments, the servant resumed his staid walk to the private dining chamber. Chapter 3. Before the sky had shifted from wintry grey into total darkness, the frigate slid into the harbour on the flood, ghosting its way between squall lines whipping the Humber's estuary. A single anchor found its temporary home in the muddy bottom of Hull Roads. Flags snapping from the 3-masters halyard received acknowledgment from the port captain's house, but no request for the ship's captain was forthcoming. This was the 3rd time the vessel had dipped into port in as many days, although it never remained for more than one tide. With Napoleon's Elba exile, many formalities had gone by the wayside, amongst them the paying of obeisance by ship's captains to port captains. Hull was a placeholder for those awaiting their pennant. The assumption made by the port's lower functionaries, their attention focused on the possibility of forced survival on a half-pay existence, was that the frigate expected orders of some sort that would lead to a life-extending commission. Preserving the sense of normality, a pimple-faced midshipman sat in the stern sheets of one of the ship's boats, approaching the Hard, a mail-bag at his feet. The youngster completed his commission without any return packets. All eyes on deck, almost all, watched as the boat returned to the starboard sallyport. After Watkins had flicked his signal from the anchorage's opposite pier, another launch pushed away from the larboard side. 8 oars invisibly stroked the harbour's slushy waters. Where the midshipman's barge had been manned by a crew pleased to escape their oaken confines, this boat carried a hard-eyed lot, commanded by the ship's purser. He was a superior example of his breed, greedy, pinchpenny, and always ready to help a victualler dispose of 10-year-old salt pork when an appropriate incentive was offered. What made him unique was that he did not keep all his gains for himself, but instead passed a 2/8 share. Both men found amusing the idea that a captain's lot extended from prize money to something less savoury, on to his master. This tribute not only earned the purser further months to continue his dealings, but also conferred upon him the honour of answering his captain's whims. Passing a rope through a ring-eye pounded into the slimy granite, the party clambered up the steps carved into the cob's face. They gathered around Watkins, but waited for their leader to join the circle. They asked no questions and sought no instructions. That was not in their remit. The hatchet-faced officer turned his gimlet eyes on Watkins. He styled himself above his origins and nature, but his sharp words betrayed his antecedents. "Finally, we've been 3 days crawling into this muck-hole and then floating back out to beat back and forth until the night tide run right to bring us back in. Are ye who we've been seeking? Who are ye? And where ye been?" Watkins flexed his broad shoulders beneath his soggy greatcoat. The wet walls creaking was an implicit threat. He never desired to seem more nor less than what he was, a creature from 7 dials. Those he encountered understood danger when they apprehended the knife scar transecting his face from right eyebrow to left cheek. "Names mean nothing. Don't need to know yours nor ye mine.
As for the how and why of our little project, none my business and I don't care. I got me gold. I be hired to bring ye and my target together. Nothing more and nothing less. Top of that, ye know 'tis not possible to predict when a cove will find his way into the net. Now shut your gob up and listen tight. I'll bring ye to the spot. Up to ye and your boys to wrestle 'em back here. How ye do it is up to ye. I'll be gone. And afore ye think to play me queer—"
Watkins pulled back his coat's tails to allow a brace of pistols and an evil-looking hanger of a Moorish cut complete that sentence. Another hard look at his former inquisitor cemented mutual understanding. The purser gulped, nodded, and silently motioned his squad forward. Throughout the exchange, none noticed a single foot and its mate, a gum-covered peg, being slowly pulled back into the gap between two hogsheads. A tarpaulin roof stretched over them, making a port of last resort for a watcher. Even in harbour, the dimness of a winter's eve saw men moving about the frigate's deck. The officers dismissed most of the watch below out of the cold to their rest. Those about on deck were malefactors whose infractions had caught the eyes of petty officers. Even though they were detailed to night watch, nobody could accuse them of being slack in their duties. Efficient handling of cables, blocks, and rigging showed they knew their way about a ship. Their ranks were undiluted by landsmen and jail sweepings dragged in by the press. That practice, a casus belli in the recently concluded American War, had vanished after Fontainebleau in April. Those who remained were only the most experienced hands crewing a reduced Royal Navy. Older ships were paying off, filling waterfronts with men looking for a berth. The Honourable East India Company's great freighters could only absorb so many sailors. The rest, flotsam of a quarter-century of war, could do little but flood the cities to cadge work they could, or beg when they could not. A wave of unemployed seamen washed across the country. Aboard this ship, though, the captain used his lofty connections to ensure that the Admiralty's eyes looked elsewhere when contemplating which ships to lay up in ordinary. He also had the pick of the fleets disestablished. Thus the complement was constantly topped up. Just last week, the frigate's fever-depleted ranks had been augmented in Newcastle by refugees from a disabled ship aground in the harbour. Both old hands and the company's newest members owned hard-earned shipboard wisdom, including when to be blind and deaf to the goings-on about them. This night was one of those times. Familiarity with the 9 men climbing through the sally port led the crew to bend more closely to their assigned tasks. Those who could drifted away to the forecastle or found reason to attend to nature's call in the heads. None paid attention as a boom was extended over the side to lower and raise a cargo net. None aboard saw the existence of 2 man-sized burdens weighing down the hempy web. If knowledge were required, their betters would tell the crew. If a sailcloth shroud were to be bent about a corpse, breathing or not, with an 18-pound shot for a footrest, being aware of it would only make a mate's life more difficult. An intelligent man would discover blindness and live. Wentworth swam to the surface as the fog beclouding his mind began to dissipate. Early on, he imagined himself in his hanging bed aboard the Laconia. That notion quickly faded, the more aware he was of his face scraping back and forth across the deck. If that was not enough, the press of another body against him, accompanied by stertorous snores, leavened by moans, spoke volumes. His shipmaster's mind immediately ran through 20 years pacing Royal Navy quarterdecks. His intimacy with the unfixed terrain of the waters surrounding northwestern Europe, led him to conclusions yet to be proven by observation. Must be working our way back toward France on a southeast heading, if the way she fights through the swell is any marker, tacking across to gain easy passage past the Downs, Deal, and Dover. Need plenty of sea room to keep shut of those damn sucking sands. Wait, if I am down here, who has the watch? Oh, this is not Laconia, but if not her, what ship? Feels like my old girl, and neither larger like a lumbering liner, nor a smaller sloop like my dear Asp. Has to be a frigate, and there are so few on Channel patrol, with most of the fleet paid off. Oh, my head feels like I caught a block falling from the mizzen's rigging. And who is in here with me? Last thing I recall is dinner. Barton. Barton upon Humber, that's it. I was at a table with a man, a gentleman. After that, though, darkness. His nose provided a partial answer, at least to the here part of his wonderings, as the oaky scent of freshly planed wood shavings, mixed with shellac's spice, registered. I remember this from when I was but a squeaker, being sent to Chip's locker to look for a long yard. Then his ears promised more answers. His companion's wheezes switched to low moans. Wentworth tested his limbs, briefly surprised that his hands and legs were unbound. Not as if I am going anywhere, if we are cruising toward Brest. So why waste cordage? He slid his hands along the deck until he could lever himself upward and crouch on his knees. He knew better than to try his unsteadiness until his head cleared. His neighbour joined him with a bout of coughing and clearing his throat.
"Hello, who is there?"
A searching hand pattered about until it hit Wentworth's thigh. Wentworth whispered, "Keep your voice low, mate, until we have sorted this out. I'm not sure what's happening, but it cannot be good." Then a name flashed before him. "Are you called Darcy? Were we dining together?" Darcy rolled away and onto his side.
"Yes, on both counts. I am Darcy,
and you must be that navy captain the innkeeper introduced. Wentworth, what sort of fiendishness is this?" "Fiendish is correct, Darcy. I have heard of such things, but usually only in the Carib trade. A hostler will pocket silver to help a merchant captain man his ship by slipping his customers rum laced with something more." Darcy's voice was stronger now, but low, in keeping with Wentworth's injunction. "Illuminating, Wentworth, but it tells me nothing about why we were taken. That remains to be seen. I assume our captors have other plans for us, because we are breathing air and not North Sea brine," Wentworth replied. Darcy grumbled and began moving with purpose. "Well, you may be content to kneel here, but I am a Darcy, and I will meet whatever fate these dogs wish to mete out on my own 2 feet." He began to stand. Wentworth felt Darcy's position change. "Wait!" A solid thunk told the story. Darcy's head slammed into a deck beam, and he collapsed with a groan. Pemberley's master fell silent as he tried to shake away the starry blizzard blinding him. Despite their grim situation, Laconia's former captain chuckled at his companion's plight. "If memory serves, Darcy, you are too long-boned for either a frigate or a sloop. Those of us bred to live on board ship quickly adjust to reduced leeway when walking about. Some argue that part of Lord Nelson's success came because he never scrambled his brains in his younger years. I once met the man. I was but a stripling adolescent, and even so, I bested him by an inch or 2. Darcy's introduction to their cell presaged the next event in their new life. The sounds of a heavy pin being removed and a stout hasp being pulled back disrupted their ruminations. A lantern's light blinded them. They creaked to their feet, Darcy keeping bent to avoid another blow. Wentworth softly cautioned, "Follow my lead."
"All right, you two. Get up and shift for yourselves. Don't know what pot you was drinking from, but you was able to take your bounty to a sign-on. Can't say but we be happy with a few extra hands. The first wants to see all volunteers afore they be read in, so's to know who's joining the company. I be Bosun Tomlinson, and ye be—"
Darcy began his protest, but the words caught in his throat when Wentworth ground a bare heel on his arch. The captain's laconic, Bristol-accented reply, thicker and less cultured than when they had sat to dinner, was limited to a few well-chosen words.
"Fred Tompkins, able, and Will Smith, landsman."
Tomlinson jumped, if not at Tompkins, and old mate's moniker, then at the West Country growl coming from the one styling himself as such. He had not heard that voice in nearly 2 years, but its timbre was unmistakable. He lifted the lamp and scanned the two faces staring back at him from the black of Chip's domain. One, a tall man, was utterly unrecognizable. A stained shirt and neckcloth could not disguise the other. If anything, the layer of grime made this man one most comfortable on a gun deck, or leaping across onto an enemy ship's quarter-deck, even more identifiable. "Cap," he began, but swallowed the word at a minute shake of the head.
"Just Tompkins and Smith, Mr. Tomlinson. I'm rated able, and he's a landsman."
Tomlinson's manner changed. He deliberately nodded, showing his understanding of Wentworth's message, and lowered his voice.
"Best ye be calling me Bosun Tommy, afore you choke on me full moniker. I won't take it unkindly or disrespectful, sir. Now, we need to get you to the first. He is as good as they come, which is saying a lot with the goings-on aboard the Persephone."